Alright everyone, it's time for today's first video. Keep in mind, of course, down below, pinned comment with links to 4 other video hosting sites that I use if you're watching this video on YouTube. Algorithm, censorship, the whole 9 yards. Anyway, I wanted to talk about how there are no cotton skyscrapers. That's a joking reference to the 1619 bullcrap of the New York Times, as well as to elements of critical race theory, which basically teach that everything prosperous about the United States was built by slaves. This couldn't be further from the truth, and in fact it's basically the opposite. The United States had one major advantage that I've spoken of over all of the other nations in the world where the population was at least reasonably literate. Back in the 1800s especially, or when the U.S. was founded several decades before that, you gotta understand, literacy in the wake of the Enlightenment had risen, so that basically if you were upper middle class, like mercantile level or something, you probably could write your own name. It was 100 years earlier, it was definitely hit or miss. And while the more poor people were usually semi-literate at best, you did have attempts at education and stuff. But that was really limited to the European area and its colonies, essentially. Elsewhere in the world, usually literacy was royalty, sometimes not even that. In the European sense, royals were often illiterate too, and the priestly class. And occasionally, people who engaged in long-distance trade needed to be able to read and write too. Most people, they didn't have the leisure time to really even speak their own language, let alone multiple languages. What happened is happenstance. You had the perfect storm of situations to allow the early United States to be a burgeoning power. Had nothing to do, by the way, with slavery. In fact, would have done better if slavery had been absent. Slavery, of course, never should have existed. It was morally and ethically wrong. What happened is that, especially in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, which is one of the big contributing factors to the U.S. becoming a superpower, you had a vast amount of arable land and a huge amount of resources that were basically untapped. The land was mostly uninhabited. Yes, I know, these evil colonizers gave plague blankets to the Indians, and that's the only way that they overcame them. That's bullshit. It's ahistorical nonsense. It's multiple civilizations that did have somewhat technological adeptitude had collapsed before the Europeans penetrated the interior of the continent. They're now thinking there's a possibility that seals, actually, up in what's now the Quebec region, New Brunswick, and some of these areas, may have given tuberculosis to the native people for the first time. It could have been Viking-related, although it certainly wouldn't have been on purpose. I'm supposed to believe, according to this theorem, that the land availability that led to the wealth of the American continent, that was largely on the backs of killing off a bunch of Native Americans with smallpox blankets, despite the fact that germ theory had not been developed. I'm hesitant to believe that very convenient but possibly screwy claim, but even if it's true, what about slavery? Because I've been told that skyscrapers were made out of cotton. This is not actually the case. If anything, the southern states that had slavery were held back economically because the idea of having like a class of people with potential mobility and potential literacy who are getting actual wages, well, that goes bye-bye if all the land is centrally held by a handful of plantation owners to the exclusion of the average landless white individual in the South that was a full-on voting citizen. It held things back considerably. The wealth gap in the South was considerable. We often think of wealth gap or whatever. We think of like Gilded Age industrialists, especially in northern cities and stuff. Look at dudes with top hats and monocles. Really, at the time, though, because it was pre-industrial, it was plantation owners and stuff. The dude with the Colonel Sanders. This was not economically feasible. Slavery was not... Once basic industry caught on, there was no longer any economic need for slaves whatsoever. Slavery gets abolished, and the period of greatest U.S. growth actually takes hold not long after. So slavery's gone, slavery's no longer legal in the United States, and then things start burgeoning. Now, part of it, so first you've got the availability of land. Just the fact that you have this massive ass continent, it's virtually unsettled between the coasts, and until the late 1800s, much of it wasn't even explored fully. Basically, at that point, you basically know where most of the mountains and rivers are. That's a long time since 1776. Not only did you have that, You have technological progress. Again, it just happens to be that point in time where industry has been developed. And the rest, again, is history. That technological development, electricity, modern waterworks, the medical science and so forth, the things that led to the continent being settled and stabilized, really, that was absent anywhere in the world until basically the end of the 1700s at least, and certainly until the true Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 19th. Before that, you have an era in which, the early United States have sort of looked like maybe rural Europe in many cases. You have a few cities, but you have a shit ton of farms. None of that was involved with slavery. The Southern plantation system was ineffective. It was inefficient. As soon as marginal technology was developed in the 1860s, it no longer made any economic feasible sense. Technically 1850s, really. Another thing that built the United States, the Homestead Act. The United States, once they, had explored the interior, they said, look at all of this land. We can grow so many crops here, but there's nobody to actually grow them. We're going to link up the coasts with the Transcontinental Railroad, and we're going to grant enormous tracts of free land in areas in between the coasts to anyone willing to go and farm it. And they did. The people paid pennies on the dollar, or literally nothing in some cases, and could get 40 acres, sometimes more, depending on circumstances. These individuals were almost entirely European in nature. In fact, it would, other than some itinerant labor from China, basically, you get a famine there, so it became a problem, who worked on the railroad and sort of built sub-communities and cities, which were not even fully of legal status in some cases. It was all white people. And there were no, by that time, there are no slaves. Slavery has been abolished. Homestead Act comes later, and then the nation begins to fill up. The Erie Canal, or the projects like that, the Panama Canal. I know that's not in the United States. Clinton decided to give it back to Panama. The United States had administered it since it was incepted 100 years before. That increase in trade from U.S. industry in the East and Europe, of course you can get people to pay tolls to use your canal, through the Panama Canal, not having to go, into the Arctic waters or all the way across Cape Horn in the other direction, across two entire oceans. Really, it cuts down time in order to travel from coast to coast for recreational purposes, which begins, as well as to Asia for trade purposes, silk, things like that. The United States economy and the general wealth and prosperity that it achieved up until the 1960s was almost entirely due to the efforts of people who are broadly European in diaspora. That's because up until the 1960s, it was legally impossible for many groups of other people in the world to even immigrate to the United States. That's why if you look at a laundry list of significant inventions by U.S. inventors throughout time, 90% of them are white. Now, this isn't to say, well, some people would say, well, that's because, blacks weren't even allowed to get a good education up until, like, well after Jim Crow. We're talking the middle of the 1900s. Absolutely. But that's not history. That's, hey, it would have been better if that had been the case. Hey, if we hadn't had segregation, the overall literacy of the population would be higher, and we'd have considerably less social problems. Yeah, that would have been nice. It would have been nice if the Democrats hadn't pioneered Jim Crow. It would have been nice if gun control had never existed because they wanted to disarm former slaves that had been emancipated. I agree totally, but that's not history. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. It would have been nice if if residents from Japan had been thrown in concentration camps by our socialist president FDR, but it happened. It would have been nice if we didn't firebomb Dresden. It would be nice if the New Madrid Fault never popped off. It'd be nice if the War of 1812 never erupted. Be nice if we hadn't invaded Vietnam, but these things, that's retrospective analytics. That's like critical race theory. It's, hey, let's reimagine things and pretend that they were some way that they weren't. Skyscrapers were built by a bunch of lower-class Italians and Irishmen and shit that came over because of scuzzy working conditions and usually lack of work in Europe. They'd get their resources. You get your young son, you got the mother of 10 kids would scrimp and save to send her oldest son over, hoping that instead of working himself to death in the Palermo mine, he could actually have a farm or some shit. And sometimes they succeeded and sometimes they didn't. This is what built the United States. Grit. Grit built the United States. I would also submit that the form of government, or rather large-scale lack thereof early on for the first 100 years, helped to prime the pump. what ended up happening is that you had a rapid expansion of personal wealth and upward mobility and increasing literacy at a rate that was beyond that of Europe, allowing the United States to become a great power. By the era after the Civil War, the United States was a power. After World War I, or technically the Spanish-American War, we become a great power, and after World War II, we become the dipole of the entire Western Hemisphere. As of the fall of the Soviet Union, technically speaking, our main opponent is China, not Russia anymore, although they've got their Sino-Russian friendship agreement, so basically thrown in their lot together at this point. They have problems too. Don't worry, diplomacy is always shifting. But yeah, there's a little bit of a refutation of the 1619 nonsense. If you want to know what built America, it was a bunch of Europeans decided to pass laws like the Homestead Act and build canals and shit like that. And they just happened to have limitless land. Look, the United States, if it had already been densely populated by that time, would be like a modern European nation in the sense that it would be densely populated, more so than it is, at twice the population. But it would have less overall economic output, potentially. It would be more like a European country. It'd be old world style. The fact is, though, that the land was 99% empty. The Native American population only migrated through most parts of the North American continent because they weren't capable of sustaining a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They followed herds and practiced horticulturalism in the rotating sense. They seasonally migrated. They didn't have permanent settlements in most parts of the United States. Europeans were the first ones to build them. That's just the way that it is. It's the inconvenient truth of history that the woke people don't want to acknowledge because they've framed that as racist to acknowledge basic historical reality. They'd rather pretend that a bunch of slaves, just like in the old days with the pyramids supposedly, which also literally didn't happen, slaves didn't build those either, that a bunch of slaves went to New York City and laboriously, one by one, with sweat dripping down their brow and the cracker cracking the whip at them, carried bricks up into the scaffolds. No, it was a bunch of Italians. It was a bunch of people from Ireland. It was literally, we've got plenty of documentary proof of this. We've got a lot of pictures. And some of them wore blackface, because there's so much soot in the air. But other than that, no, most of them were European. And there were some Asian individuals from China specifically in the 1800s. They come to work on rail lines and shit. They weren't even given citizenship. They were they were just tolerated residents that had the ability to work, and that's basically all. Some of them were literal servants. That's about all. Peace out.